Okay, good evening. This is Joseph Holbrook once again, and today we are going to be talking about, let me get lined up properly here. Today we are going to be talking about the arrival of Christianity. This is, I think, my fourth lecture in this series, and this is part of a course that I'm teaching on Latin America, religion in Latin America for the Religious Studies Department in 2019. So let us begin. So I got a nice little picture here of an artist's imagination of Christopher Columbus with his cross, and you see some flags in the background and some Taino or Arawak Indians encountering the Spanish as they arrived in the Bahamas and get off their boats. So let's jump right in. So the process of bringing Christianity to the Indies, in this process, the Spanish conquistadors laid waste to high civilizations of the Americas in the name of Christianity. Speaking of high civilizations, we're thinking of the Aztec, the Inca, and the Maya. They carried the sword and the cross. And I've already explained how Spanish Catholicism became uniquely militant, violently militant in the process of religious warfare in the Iberian Peninsula over several centuries. So they transported this militant form of Catholicism across the Atlantic and brought it now to the Amerindians, or the First Nations peoples of the Western Hemisphere. Let me back up. And let me also qualify that we've seen that there's always, in every point in history, there's two sides to the church, or the two faces of the church. We'll be talking more about that, even as some priests and many conquistadors came to conquer with the power of the sword and to enhance their wealth and prestige. There were also missionaries, admittedly fewer in number, but Spanish Catholic missionaries who came motivated by deep piety and were concerned to protect the rights of the indigenous. The arrival in the New World immediately triggered some major theological and intellectual struggles. As I've explained elsewhere in other lectures, the medieval concept of the world, or the cosmos, was very much based on biblical themes such as the Holy Trinity, Father, Son, and Spirit. Also, the three sons of Noah, who went in, according to the story, who went out from the landing place of the ark in three directions to three continents and founded three racial groups: the Japheth, Ham, and Shem, who were the when I said Ham, I mean Ham. Ham is the son, and Canaan is the grandson of Noah. And these were the progenitors of supposedly of the Europeans, the Asians, and the Africans. Obviously, arriving in the Western Hemisphere and finding an entire vast continent that creates four continents instead of three, and this immediately breaks the paradigm of the Holy Trinity, or the three sons of Noah, the cruciform shape of the continents with the heart of the cross crossing over Jerusalem. This all had to be rethought in the light of new empirical data. And also this new race of people who were quickly came to be called Indios, or Indians, with a reference to the initial attempt to travel to India. Disagreements over the temporal authority of the Pope also came about. Did the Pope have authority over the New World pagans? Or only do pagans living in the former territories of the Roman Empire? Traditionally, intellectuals and theologians had believed that the Pope had authority over the former territory of the Roman Empire, which would have included most of Europe and northern Africa, and over any pagans living in those lands. But now we have a whole new race of people. I use the word race loosely here, but a whole new people group living in a whole new territory that had nothing to do with the Roman Empire. How does the Pope relate to that in terms of his authority? How far does his authority extend? A Scottish theologian named John Mayer, using Aristotle as his source or framework intellectually, postulated that the American natives were natural slaves. Aristotle had famously conjectured that some people were natural rulers, others were natural slaves, and therefore they needed to be ruled. So this theologian, John Mayer, said it's okay to enslave them. They're natural slaves because they're at a lower level of technical or cultural superiority or development. Francisco de Vitoria of the School of Salamanca in Spain believed that the Indians had all the characteristics of civilization and the use of reason. But even the members of the School of Salamanca struggled over the issue of the practice of cannibalism and human sacrifice. And so what the School of Salamanca did was they defended the Indians as human beings with souls, but they postulated that they were children, that they were innocent or naive and needed parenting. They needed discipline. They needed someone to help tutor them in the ways of civilization, which of course was very patronizing and put them in an inferior place. There was a big debate in Valladolid in 1550 through 1551. I was trying to think of some cute, catchy name I could give it, like some of the prize fighting in the 1970s, the one that was called the Rumble in the Jungle, and some of those, but I couldn't think of anything catchy, so we'll have to just continue to be boring here. But it was a big deal. Juan Gines de Sepulveda was argued from one side of the discussion. Using John Mayer's argument, he argued, and using Aristotle, he argued that the Indians were natural slaves, and therefore the monarchs of Spain had every right to take their lands and enslave them. Bartolomé de las Casas, the Dominican priest that we will see several times as one of the defenders of the indigenous peoples, advocated on behalf of the rights of the Indians. So right here in this debate, you have the two faces of the church come together. Las Casas argued that the Indians were justified in their self-defense. They could not be considered to be heretics because they had never heard the gospel. Each side, after the debate was over, claimed victory, but in the end, the debate brought no real change in Spain's policies, although there's no doubt that historically that Bartolomé de las Casas was much better prepared and the weight of the argument was in his favor. However, it didn't make any real difference in the long run anyway. So these for Sepulveda, the cross and the sword were inextricably intertwined, and should be. For Las Casas, the church must bring true conversion by example, by good works, by pastoral care, not by coercion. Good advice for today, even. In Spain, there was no way to separate the political from the religious. In this way, I don't want to get off of my notes here, but there might be some interesting parallels between medieval and early modern Spain, Spanish Catholicism, and Islam at certain periods of time, in the sense that it's difficult to separate the political from the religious. Every theological dispute became a political disagreement. Here's an interesting little item, the Requerimiento, which was written in 1514, became sort of a fig leaf that the Spanish conquistadors could use to cover their brutality and violence. It was a declaration read aloud in Spanish without a translator to the Indians before they were attacked, speaking of the Holy Universal Church and the Pope and the Spanish king, and commanding or inviting the Indians to voluntarily submit to the Spanish monarch and to the Holy Catholic faith. And if they didn't voluntarily submit, they would be subject to, they would be considered to be rebels, and they would be subject to attack and subjugation. And of course, the Indians had no clue what was being read to them because it was in Spanish. And as soon as they gave them a few minutes to respond, if they didn't respond, the Spanish were free to attack and to defeat them and enslave them. Efforts at conversion. The laws of Burgos were initiated in 1512. It was an attempt to curtail the worst excesses of the colonists, but it was entirely ineffective. Basically, the colonists just ignored these reforms. And in 1542, under Charles V, another attempt was made called the New Laws, were enacted in an attempt to control the inheritance of encomiendas and to protect the dwindling indigenous population. Also, one reason to control the inheritance of encomiendas was, as they were being passed down from generation to generation, it was creating a new strata of nobility in the new world, and the king didn't want that. That would possibly cramp the monarchy's authority and control in the new world. And so this was an attempt to discourage the inheritance of encomiendas. There was also attempts to change social structures of the Native Americans. For example, banning trial marriages. There was one tribe in Ecuador that practiced trial marriages. A young couple who thought they might get married and raise a family together could move in and spend a year in sort of a trial marriage. They could even have a child, and if it didn't work out, they were free to go their separate ways, and the child was considered to be a valid child and not a bastard, as such a child would be considered in medieval Europe or early modern Europe. There was no social stigma for the child or for the wife. Obviously, this is very different than Spanish Catholicism at this point in time, and so they tried to discourage this practice of trial marriages. They also disrupted Indian society through relocations. You'll see some of this in the film The Mission, although it puts it in its best light, and it often was an attempt to protect and help the Native Americans. But there were times in parts of the Americas where the relocation of Indians was coercive. These were called congregaciones or reducciones in the Andes Mountains. In Brazil, they were called aldeias. Premarital sex was forbidden, which was not typically a Native American perspective, as was having multiple wives. Here's a picture from one of the scenes near the end of the film, The Mission, with Father Gabriel leading the Guarani Indians in to celebrate the Eucharist while they're under attack by Brazilian troops. In Paraguay, for example, the Jesuits were fairly successful in maintaining Guarani congregaciones. Together with the Indian residents, the missionaries were able to protect the communities from Spanish colonists. That is up until about the 1750s. I think it was after the Treaty of Madrid, in which these congregaciones of Guarani and Paraguay were handed over to the Brazilians, and the Jesuits were expelled from the country. So they were not able to protect the Guarani. There were actually 2 or 3 wars between the Guarani and the Brazilian troops, beginning around 1650 and culminating in the 1750s. And another occasion, I'll give a little background on the historical facts behind the film The Mission. Great film, by the way, one of my favorites. By 1557, the Jesuits were in full support of the Portuguese crown's military operations against resistant communities. This is a particular situation. Of course, this changed in the 1600s and 1700s. The Jesuits were in opposition, but as we've said, there's always 2 faces. The military success of bringing Indians to the aldeas led to more than 40,000 Indians in the Bahia, which is the northeastern part of Brazil, living in Jesuit-controlled communities where they experienced disruptions of their traditional social patterns and dislocation from traditional environments. As in Spanish America, the removal of such a large number of Indians from the potential labor pool in Portuguese America resulted in conflicts with the settlers. And again, you see that illustrated in the movie The Mission, where the settlers are adamantly against the Jesuits' attempts to protect the Guarani Indians in Paraguay. The friars, or the religious orders. The Franciscans was the order of friars minor. It was one of the first mendicant groups to get involved in the new Western Hemisphere. It became the largest order in the New World and played a significant role in the evangelization of Indians, especially in New Spain, which is modern Mexico, and to a lesser extent perhaps in Peru. The Franciscans, or the Order of Friars Minor, was founded in 1210 by St. Francis of Assisi. They reflected the values that were counter to the prevailing secular culture of the time. They insisted on poverty and simplicity, chastity. They possessed a strong missionary zeal. Many believed that the second coming of Christ was at hand, and they needed to baptize as many people as possible. Some of the Franciscans, perhaps not all, had been influenced by the teachings of a mystic, an Italian mystic by the name of Joachim Fiore, who had taught that there were 3 ages in human history: the age of the Father, the age of the Son, the age of the Spirit. And the age of the Son had begun with the birth of Christ, but he believed that was coming to an end, and the age of the Spirit was about to begin. When we get to the end of this course and talk about Pentecostalism, it'll be interesting to go back and reflect on Joachim's views of a kingdom of the Spirit or an age of the Spirit. However, this sense among the Franciscans that the age of the Spirit was about to begin and that Christ was going to return soon and bring an end to history made them feel that they a sense of urgency in their work among the Native Americans of New Spain, and they basically ditched any effort to teach the Indians or translate the truths of the Catholic faith into their language, and they just began baptizing huge numbers. There are reports of as many as 1 million or more being baptized in a short period of time. Hernan Cortez sent a special request to Charles V to send Franciscan missionaries to him in New Spain after the conquest of Tenochtitlan. And they came in 1524. This is just 5 years after the conflict with Tenochtitlan began, and they came as a group of 12. This was a deliberate symbolism. They selected 12 Franciscans and sent them to New Spain, to the Valley of Mexico, symbolizing the Christ sending out the 12 apostles. So they are called the 12 apostles of Mexico. These particular 12 friars believed that the end of the world was imminent. They had a sense of urgency in their work. They arrived in the Americas and found indigenous peoples dying in massive numbers from the plague because of their lack of immunity. And of course, they didn't understand immunity or the medical aspect of it, so they took it as a sign of the end. And they began baptizing multitudes of Indians. By 1533, there were 60 or so Franciscans in Mexico who claimed to have performed the sacrament for 1.2 million Indians. That's just about 11 years after they arrived. By 1536, another 3.8 million had been brought into the Christian faith through their method. The Dominicans, the other orders, who were also in Mexico, which included Dominicans, Augustinians, and Jesuits. Actually, Jesuits came a little bit later. They were troubled by the lack of teaching or indoctrination being offered to the Indians. The Dominicans, or the order of preachers, were founded in 1216, almost at the same time as the Franciscans, by Saint Dominic. They tended to be more intellectual than the Franciscans and more involved in education. They are called the Order of Preachers. They brought with them a commitment to educate the Native Americans before their conversion so they could make an intelligent and adult decision about conversion. One of these was one of the Augustinian missionaries was Friar Pedro Serrano, who learned how to preach in 3 indigenous languages in New Spain. The Society of Jesus was a different kind of order. It's not considered to be a mendicant order. It was founded in 1534 in response to the Protestant Reformation by a soldier mystic named Saint Ignatius de Loyola. He was wounded after a war in Italy and was recovering and began to spend time in meditation and prayer, and had a mystical experience calling him to form a religious order. In 1548, the Jesuits first arrived in Brazil. Father Antonio Vieira was raised in Bahia. He's one of the more notable Jesuit priests. He entered the Society of Jesus as a 15-year-old in 1623. During Lent of 1653, he scorched the Portuguese settlers with a sermon in which he threatened them with damnation to hell if they didn't change their ways in terms of their treatment of the Native Americans. He said, "All of you are in mortal sin. All of you live in a state of condemnation for living off the blood of enslaved Indians, and all of you are going directly to hell. Indeed, many are there now, and you will soon join them if you do not change your life." Needless to say, that didn't make him terribly popular. So he represents the face of the church looking toward the Native Americans, toward the oppressed, eventually towards the Africans, slaves. In this case, when we start talking about the priesthood in this period of time in Latin America, we have to make a distinction between regular orders and secular priests. And neither one of these words mean what you might think they mean initially. In this case, regular means under a rule or a ruler. Regulated would be another way to think of it. So the religious orders are under a regulation to live a certain way, live according to certain standards. Usually they had higher education standards. It was much more demanding, and harder to get into a religious order than a secular position. The secular priests were not part of a religious order. They were just diocesan priests or parish priests reporting directly to the bishop. And of course, the bishop was nominated and then nominated by the Spanish monarchy and approved by the Vatican. So bishops, archbishops, priests were secular, and they were under the authority of the Spanish monarchy and indirectly the Vatican. Hernan Cortez intentionally requested regulars because as opposed to seculars, because he didn't trust the worldliness of the seculars. He saw them as greedy and easily tempted. His views were shared by many, including the Spanish crown. A secular priest often might be motivated into the priesthood as a vocation. There weren't that many job tracks or career tracks in those days. And so one career track, if you were a second or third son of a wealthy landowner, so you were not going to inherit the hacienda or the plantation, one possible career track was to become a priest and receive a small income. When Charles V needed to send priests into the New World, he turned to the revitalized mendicant orders. This posed a problem for the king because he wanted to establish an episcopal system in the Americas. Such structures relied upon bishops, archbishops, and an ecclesiastical hierarchy, typically comprised of secular priests. Pope Adrian VI assisted Charles by issuing the bull Omnimoda in 1522, allowing the mendicant orders to wield enormous ecclesiastical power in the New World. The Spanish king did not like that the mendicant orders were more loyal to their own orders than to the episcopal authorities. In other words, Franciscan priests were more loyal to their Franciscan superiors than they were to the local bishop, especially the Jesuits. The Jesuits were even more so because they took a pledge of obedience to what's called the Black Pope, or the head of the Jesuit order, and to the Pope himself. And so the Jesuits, they reported directly through their structure to the Pope, not through the nation-state monarchies. And this is one reason why they were not liked by the monarchies of Spain or Portugal or France. Faith in the Americas. The mestizaje of the Roman Catholic Church, there was a mixture, there was a genetic mixture and a race mixture as Europeans, Native Americans, African slaves began to interbreed, but there was also a theological mixture. In order to communicate their message, the missionaries needed to learn the native languages, but that was not enough. They also needed to teach in the images and metaphors that the natives understood. Just to know the language doesn't mean you know the right word for God or Satan or for grace or the Holy Trinity. Fernando Ortiz of Cuba calls this transculturation, where the cultural change is going both ways, not just one way. Andrés de Olmos wrote the first Nahuatl grammar text in 1547. Bernardino de Sahagún was a Franciscan in New Spain, and he wrote a Aztec history, developed an Aztec grammar, and developed a written Aztec language beginning in 1569. They also used metaphors. For example, in South America, they could point to the Southern Cross in the skies, and they could also talk about the shape of a condor in flight or the seeds of various fruit. Yet the very use of indigenous images conveyed in conversion efforts altered Christianity itself. Whenever you're going through cultural change, it goes both ways. You can't change someone without being changed. Cuauhtlatoatzin converted to Christianity, was baptized and given the Christian name Juan Diego. In 1531, Juan Diego was walking into Mexico City when he heard his name called from a nearby hill called Tepeyac. In pre-Hispanic Aztec site had been located there, dedicated to the Virgin. Let me move this. I can't see it. No, to the Virgin Mother Goddess Tonatzin. There on the hill was an apparition of the Virgin Mary dressed as an Aztec princess. She spoke to him in native Nahuatl to convey her desire to build a shrine on that site. Juan Diego obeyed her directives and went straight to the bishop. The first bishop of New Spain was Juan de Zumarraga. On Juan Diego's fourth visit to her, the Virgin Mary supplied a sign of roses in the middle of winter, and the bishop complied finally when he was convinced that it was a miracle with the wishes of the Virgin, and constructed a shrine on the very hill once dedicated to the Aztec Mother Goddess. For the indigenous community of Mexico, the appearance indicated a commitment to them and legitimized their place in the social order. There are other examples of this, of these kinds of national virgins or local regional virgins. In Cuba, it's La Virgen de Caridad de Cobre. In Bolivia, Our Lady of Copacabana. In Brazil, it's Our Lady Aparecida. In Nicaragua, it's Our Lady of the Immaculate Conception of El Viejo. And most of these have myths or have stories about their apparition. Nevertheless, the old ways continued, even as missionaries successfully managed to convert immense numbers of Native Americans over to the Christian faith. One example of this is the Andean god let me see if I can pronounce this. Pachacamac, the two-faced creator and destroyer, told his people, I have been angry with you because you have abandoned me and accepted the God of the Christians. But I have set aside my anger because the God of the Christians and I have agreed that you should serve us both. And both he and I are well pleased that you should act in this way. Obviously, if you're talking to certain Christian groups, they would not believe that theologically. They would reject it out of hand because Christianity tends to be very exclusive in its claims. However, from the Andean side or the Incan side, there was a willingness to add and mix and match together a little bit of Christianity with a little bit of the old Andean god or Andean religion. Andean Indians offered traditional gifts of guinea pigs, coca, and chicha to images of Catholic saints on Christian feast days. These just happened to also be at the time they traditionally would have made sacrifices to the Huacas. When the festival of Corpus Christi became intricately linked with the Andean observance of Carhuamita, or the ripening of the maize. Amerindians often reverted to old religious practices, not just old religious symbols. This is Don Carlos, who was a Aztec noble who in 1539 was executed after going through torture with the Inquisition because of his resistance to Catholicism and his call for Native Americans to return to the traditional Aztec religious beliefs. Some Mayas confessed to Spanish officials that the Indians were also crucifying victims, usually children, before removing their hearts and throwing the still crucified bodies into sinkholes, thought to be the entryway to the underworld and the home of Choc, the Mayan rain god. So crucifying and taking out their hearts, this is syncretism. Some of the sacrifices occurred during Holy Week and Easter. For the Spaniards, the timing of the supposed human sacrifice was an outrage above all others. So finally, in 1571, the Inquisition was officially established in Mexico. Although pure-blood Indians were exempt from the Inquisition, recent converts were considered too simple-minded to understand fully the requirements of the faith. The Inquisition especially sought out alumbradismo and crypto-Judaism. Crypto-Judaism is hidden Jews, under the radar. Alumbradismo is a sort of mysticism, or Enlightenment mysticism. There were also trials for bigamy, witchcraft, and blasphemy. And sometimes African slaves would commit blasphemy on purpose to force the Inquisition to take control of them, to get them out of the control of their masters. And here's a picture from the Inquisition. Rather horrible. So in conclusion, the two faces of the church were very clear during the early history of the encounter between the Europeans and the Americans. Spaniards fought against other Spaniards, both militarily as well as theologically and intellectually. Scholars were forced to reevaluate their understanding of the world. Monarchs took seriously their roles as fathers to the Indians, with mixed results. The religious orders turned to force and coercion to bring the love of God to resistant Indian groups. The church itself had to face the ineffectiveness of its message. Subjugated groups were forced to improvise and syncretize. Some rebelled, and others accommodated. So this is a initial introduction into the arrival of Christianity. Next week we'll talk about the shaping of the faith. Thank you very much. Talk to you later.